This is the video for page 466, 1 through 23 odd. Your homework was 2 through 24 even. Okay, so the first question is negative square root of 24. Now remember before, when you had a negative under a square root, it was not a real number. But in this case, we know that if we break it up, square root of negative 1 times the square root of 24, we know that the square root of negative 1 is I. And then we're just going to multiply it by, once we simplify this, 24 is 6 times 4, 4 is 2 times 2, and 6 is 3 times 2. So we need 2 of them in order to bring it out front. So we're going to have I times 2 square root of 6, which is 2I square root of 6. Okay, same situation here, except for you have negative 1 times square root of negative 1 times the square root of 36. This negative 1 comes from this negative here, square root of negative 1 comes from here, and then the square root of 36 comes from here. We know that we're just going to leave negative 1 alone. Square root of negative 1 is I, and the square root of 36 is 6. So negative 1 times I times 6 is negative 6I. Okay, same situation here. We can do 8 times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 63. 8 comes from the 8 out front. Square root of negative 1 comes from this negative here, and the square root of 63 comes from this 63 here. We're just going to leave 8 alone. Square root of negative 1 is I, and the square root of 63 we're going to have to break down. 63 is 7 times 9, and 9 is 3 times 3. So you're going to bring a 3 out front, and then you're going to leave a 7 inside. So we're going to do 8 times I times 3, which is going to give us 24I, and then what's left inside is just the square root of 7. Remember, always multiply the outside and then always multiply the inside. In this case, we only have 1 inside, so then we just tack it on to the end. All right, negative square root of 54 is negative 1, because of this negative here, times the square root of 54. And the square root of 54 can just be broken down 6 times 9. 9 is 3 times 2, or I'm sorry, 6 is 3 times 2, and 9 is 3 times 3. So you need 2 in order to bring it out front, and then everything else stays inside. So this gives me negative 1 times 3 square root of 6, which is just negative 3 square root of 6. Okay, you've got the square root of negative 2 times the square root of 7, so we're going to break these up into the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 2 times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 7. Now we know the square root of negative 1 is I, and we can't do anything with the square root of 2, and then the square root of negative 1 is I, and then we can't do anything with the square root of 7. So this gives us I squared times the square root of 14, and we know I squared is equal to negative 1. So then this gives us negative 1, the square root of 14, which we're just going to simplify to the negative square root of 14. Okay, number 11, same situation. You've got the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 5 times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 10. Okay, that's breaking these up. Square root of negative 1 here, square root of 5, square root of negative 1, square root of 10. Square root of negative 1 is I, and then the square root of 5 is just square root of 5. Square root of negative 1 is I, and then the square root of 10 is just the square root of 10. Because if you break down 10, you just get 5 and 2. So this gives us I squared, when you multiply them together, square root of 50. I squared is negative 1, and let's see if we can break this down at all. 5 times 10, and then 5 times 2. So we can bring a 5 out front. So I'm going to write this over here. Negative 1 times 5 square root of 2, which is going to give me negative 5 square root of 2. Okay, so here we have the square root of 16, which we know is 4, and the square root of negative 1, which we know is I. So when you multiply them together, you just get 4I. All right. So in our numerator, we're going to have the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 9 over the square root of 3, which we know the square root of negative 1 is I, and the square root of 9 is 3 over the square root of 3. So this gives us 3I over the square root of 3. However, you can't have a radical in your denominator, so we must rationalize the denominator by multiplying by square root of 3 over square root of 3. So we get 3I square root of 3 over 3, because remember, this is the square root of 3 squared, and those cancel. These 3's cancel, leaving you I square root of 3. Alright, so square root of negative 80 is the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 80 over the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 10. Let's go ahead and see if we can simplify the square root of 80. 80 is 8 and 10, 8 is 4 and 2, and 4 is 2 and 2, and 10 is 5 and 2. So you need 2 in order to bring it out front. So there's one set of 2's and another set of 2's. So that's actually going to give us 4 out front and square root of 5 inside. So when I change this, I'm going to get an I here and a 4 square root of 5. So that's going to give me I times 4 square root of 5 over I times the square root of 10, which looks like 4I square root of 5 over I square root of 10. Okay, so your i's are going to cancel each other out, leaving you 4 square root of 5 over the square root of 10. However, you can't have a radical in the denominator, so let me just move it over here. So in order to rationalize the denominator, I multiply by the square root of 10 over the square root of 10, giving me 4 square root of 50 over 10, because remember, square root of 10 squared gives you 10. And then we just need to simplify the square root of 50, which is 5 times 10, and 10 is 5 times 2. So a 5 is going to come out front, leaving a 2 inside. But that 5 that comes out front has to be multiplied times this 4. So that's going to give us 20 square root of 2 over 10. And then these can both be reduced to 2 and 1, leaving you 2 square root of 2. Okay, now we're actually doing operations on I, which are just like combining like terms. So since we're just distributing a negative 1 here, we have 4 minus 7I plus 2 plus 3I. Now all you're going to do is combine like terms. So you have 4 plus 2 and negative 7I plus 3I. So 4 plus 2 is 6, and negative 7I plus 3I is negative 4I. And since they're not like terms, you can't combine them, so that's your final answer. All right, here I actually do have to distribute the negative. So you get 6 plus 5I minus 8 plus I. It's plus because a negative times a negative is a positive. So when you combine like terms, you do 6 plus 8 and 5I plus I. I'm sorry, 6 minus 8. So 6 minus 8 is negative 2. 5I plus I is 6I. So it's negative 2 plus 6I. All right, now here you'll also have to distribute the negative. So it's 6 minus 8 minus 4I. Negative times a positive is a negative. Combine your like terms. 6 minus 8 is negative 2, and then just bring down your minus 4I. And that's your final answer there. And that is the entire homework. Have a good night, and I'll see you tomorrow.